Welcome to Conversations Cafe. I'm your host, Cheryl Nason, and I could go on and on about the gentleman I'm about to introduce you to. His book is fascinating, he is fascinating, and his name is Dr. Robert Smith, and he's the Provost and Senior Vice President from Texas Tech University, but we're not here to talk about Texas Tech. We're here to talk about his book, The Way of Oz. Bob, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Cheryl. It's a real privilege to be here with you today.
Well, I've had such a wonderful time talking to you. I almost wish that the cameras had been on before we even started in the studio. Let's give the viewers just a little bit about your background, because you are so interesting and you've done so many things.
Well, I'll try to make it really short. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area and went to St. John's University to become a pharmacist. And when I was studying, I realized that pharmacy was not being practiced the way I wanted it to be practiced. And so I said, well, I've got to go into higher education. Went on to the University of Michigan, earned master's and PhD degrees, taught at the University of Iowa and UT Austin in pharmacy schools, then went off into central administration, chief research officer, and dean of the graduate school at Washington State University, then at the University of Connecticut, then back to University of Arkansas for 8 years as provost, now at Tech in my 4th year as provost.
Can I just say, wow.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Now, how did the idea, this book is based on The Wizard of Oz, both the book and the film. How did the idea for this come into your mind?
Actually, as I mentioned in the book, I was really not a great fan of the Oz story growing up, but I interviewed for a job at the University of Kansas back in 1995. And I said to myself, you know, I bet, you know, since I'm going to Kansas, I probably ought to make some allusions to Oz. And so I read Patrick Hearn's annotated version of the original, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which has a lot of memorabilia and notation about the book and about the author, and it really piqued my interest. Now, the curious thing is, I found people in Kansas had no more read the book, the original 1900 book by L. Frank Baum, than anyone else I had ever met. And so that sort of piqued my interest. And then, actually, when I went to Arkansas, I had a colleague who was also interested in The Wizard of Oz. So we sort of played off one another and started using the allusion to the Oz stories. And of course, found in the course of all of this that, you know, there are symbols and metaphors in the original story and in the movie about wisdom, about courage, about love and heart, about leadership, and about wisdom. And all that developed as I was writing the book over the last 4 years. And I think it's an opportunity to share some thoughts about how to literally lead your life. And I think it will be appealing. I wrote it particularly for adolescents, but I think it may be appealing to a broader audience.
If I were still teaching English, I would use this book along with the film, the 1939 film with Judy Garland that everyone's so familiar with, and the book, and use this as a way to frame it in a different sort of perspective and bring it home, because this is so fascinating. You've taken the characters, the major characters that we all know, the Lion, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and Dorothy. You've given them characteristics that are very interesting. You've talked about how they demonstrate those characteristics that they want, and yet they demonstrate them. A classic example, of course, is the Cowardly Lion, who helps in several instances. He stands up for his friends, and he really helps rescue them in certain instances. There's so much that we can talk about. Let's talk about L. Frank Baum's original book, because there are differences from the movie in the book. One of the most striking differences that hit me was the ruby red slippers. That's not an original thing.
Yeah, the original slippers in the book, of course, were silver. there was a great interest in the late 19th century in the idea of silver and gold as a backing for currency. And so that was part of the interest, perhaps, and why he chose silver. But when they made the 39 film, silver didn't go so well against the yellow brick road, and so they made them red. And of course, there were 6 pairs that were crafted, and there's still one, of course, in the American History Museum, part of the Smithsonian. And actually, I was there only about 2 years ago, and it's one of the most popular exhibits in that museum. People literally flock around them and have their pictures taken with them. But that's one difference, of course. But most importantly is that in the movie, at the end, you're given the idea that it was all a dream. In the book and in the sequels, many people don't know there were 13 sequels that Baum wrote to the original story from 1904 through actually 2 were published posthumously, but through 1920. And in all those stories, Oz is a very real place. And Dorothy actually goes to Oz in the home that's lifted from what was portrayed as the Kansas prairie, because when she comes back in the book, Uncle Henry has rebuilt the home because it went away. So it is a very real place. And then all the sequels build on this idea of people going to Oz, and then all the myriad characters that come out in the sequels.
What is the bottom line of the book? Let's give a little bit of an overview and bottom line so that our viewers will understand what we're talking about, because I'm afraid I'm mishmashing the book, and I want people to understand what it is.
Well, basically, you take the metaphors of the principal characters, and you relate them, in the case of the Scarecrow, to wisdom and learning. The Tin Woodman to heart and loving. The Cowardly Lion to service and courage. Dorothy, she's the leadership person. She's the person in the modern framework who helps people out through her own understanding, through her own courage, through her own empathy. But she's also very savvy about what you have to do in order to be successful in the 21st century. You have to understand planning and diversity and sustainability and political and scientific understanding, and you have to take on personal responsibility for others. And then I play the wizard in a very different way than some people might have imagined. He was humiliated both in the book and in the movie. So he is a symbol of humility, but other related virtues. And so we highlight then integrity, empathy, beneficence as key elements in leading one's life. And what's most important, with ethics in the lead. And I talk about how important ethics is, because the problem we're in right now in terms of the recession is because people are not acting ethically across the entire spectrum, not only in our own country, but countries literally around the world. So it's really a framework for lifelong learning, loving, serving, having a future focus, which is the primary theme for Dorothy, and then humility, other virtues, with ethics in the lead.
And you also weave the story of the author, which in itself is a fascinating story. You also weave that in the book as well.
Yeah, Frank Baum is underrated. He really was a polymath. He did so many different things. He wrote plays, he wrote lyrics to songs, he acted in plays. He was a producer. He was one of the first film producers in Hollywood. He built an entire studio himself. He was an interior designer. He bred prize chickens for a while. He sold oil. He sold ceramics in Chicago. He did so many things, and he was actually good at quite a number of things, but he also failed. And the whole idea of humility, the whole idea of failure, much as the wizard fails in some part of the stories, that's Frank Baum himself. He was exuberant. He threw himself into everything. When he was raising prize chickens back in the late 1800s, he started the Poultry Association in New York, and he became the secretary of that. When he moved to South Dakota, and he was a merchant, and he was a publisher and a printer, he started a baseball team, a semi-pro baseball team. And the other interesting thing that people don't know is Oz is not in Kansas, it's in South Dakota, where he spent several years before he went to Chicago. And he really didn't want to insult the folks in South Dakota because a number of them from Aberdeen are really portrayed in the stories. And so he put it in Kansas. He spent very little time in Kansas during his entire life.
Who knew that Oz was in South Dakota? I love it. I love it. The White City, I thought this information about the Emerald City and the comparison to the White City at the Chicago World's Fair, I did not remember that when the four characters came to Oz, that the gatekeeper made them put on green glasses. And of course the wizard has been sort of tricking everybody. The city is actually white and they're wearing green glasses, so of course it's emerald.
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
Well, see, here again, the difference between the film and the book. In the book, the Emerald City really is green, and it actually is in Art Deco style. And Art Deco wasn't really recognized in the world till 1922. So Baum had no sense of Art Deco, but he did spend time in Chicago. He lived in Chicago from around 1891 through 2006 or so. And during that time, of course, the Columbia Exposition of 1893 occurred, and there were a lot of allusions in the book to various people and events and structures. And one structure was the White City they created out of really temporary kinds of materials, but it was very beautiful. It was Victorian Orientalist design, and that's really what Dusty Higgins has portrayed here in the book and also on the cover. Now, the thing with the green glasses is there were emeralds in the Emerald City in the book, but there weren't enough of them to really make the whole city shine. So the idea of putting green glasses in, and Dusty has a wonderful image both of Toto and Dorothy with the green glasses on. Everybody has to wear them, so the illusion is that everything is green. And it comes from a joke, because when Frank lived in South Dakota, there was a terrible drought, and they didn't have enough food for the horses and the cattle. So he said, well, maybe we should put green glasses on the horses and we can serve them sawdust, and they'll think it's oats.
Oh, no.
And that's really where the idea of the green glasses came from.
The book is just so filled with ideas and information. When I walked into the studio today, the cameraman who's running my camera and I began to talk about the book, and he began to look through the book, and it immediately sparked conversation. I'm sure that this happens almost everywhere you go where you have an opportunity to talk about the book, because people have questions. They want to know, how's the movie like the film? How's the movie like the book? How's the book different from the movie? I mean, I'm sure that those are the kinds of questions that come up. We're going to take a short break.
Okay.
Don't go away. We'll be right back with Dr. Robert Smith, and we'll talk some more about Oz. Welcome back. We're having such a fascinating conversation with Dr. Robert Smith about his book, The Way of Oz. We've got to talk about the strong female characters in the book, because I think that's really, really important. Let's talk about Glinda, the, quote, good witch.
Of course, you know, there were 4 witches in the book. Unfortunately, that's another difference in the movie. When you see what is portrayed as Glinda in the opening scenes where she's in Munchkinland, they refer to her as Glinda, but that in the book, that was not Glinda. That was the Good Witch of the North. She doesn't get much of a play in the book, but Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, and you may recall from reading the book that there really are 4 countries within Oz, and Quadling Land, which is south of the Emerald City, That is headed by Glinda, the Good Witch of the South. And Glinda is very important because, and she's even acknowledged in the sequels by Ozma, who becomes the queen over all of Oz. She's acknowledged as the most powerful sorceress, but she's a good witch. And what she does is she helps people, and she serves as a model for a very powerful woman, almost a sort of a mother figure, a woman who says, you have to do things for yourself. You have to upwell the power from yourself to be good. And that's the message she gives to the main characters. And Dorothy is empowered both by Glinda and by Ozma in the sequels. And Dorothy becomes the great leadership figure. And my hope is that this next century, whenever that emerges, will be the century of the woman. Because women are doing very, very well now. They exceed in universities. I mentioned to you earlier that I was at study abroad programs in Europe this summer. Overwhelmingly, they're women students. The women are taking the chances. The women are going out and leading now like we've never seen in the past. And my hope is this will be an additional inspiration to young women. Not that we want to denigrate men in any way. We want them to take the example of what women are doing now. And women can be in the lead for a while. And we want them to, whoever emerges, and the women are emerging, and that's part of the book as well. And the other part of it is, that's very important, is Frank Baum's mother-in-law, who was very influential in his life. He married a young woman who mother did not care very much for because he was an actor at the time. And people were very suspicious of actors and them being on the road, etc. But she respected Maud's choice, and she turns out to be a very important character in the life of L. Frank Baum. She was a confidant and really a collaborator with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and she wrote the trilogy about women's suffrage in the late 1900s. She doesn't get credit for this because she was an unusually strong, outspoken woman, and she was the woman who, when he was a salesman in Chicago back in the late 1890s and was starting to bring little stories home that would become the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, she said, you'd be a damn fool not to write those things down and publish it as a book.
Wow. One of the things I love about the book is that it does exactly what you just described. It intertwines history with what's going on. And I couldn't help but think of Alice in Wonderland. The same kind of political kinds of statements, and you look at characters and they actually represent other things. And one of the things that I thought about teaching was this makes the literature live in a different way. Being able to take The Way of Oz, overlay it with the book and the film and say, okay, here's what was really going on. This is the perspective that L. Frank Baum had when he was writing this book. Here are the people who influenced him. Here's what was going on in society. This is why this happened this way. If he'd lived at another time, the book would have probably never happened.
Right. Yeah, and you could even take The Wizard as an example. He really distilled imagery from several people to make The Wizard. The wizard in the book looks bald and kind of disheveled, and he really used John D. Rockefeller as a model for that. Then he took P.T. Barnum, who was a hokum character.
Exactly.
And then he took Thomas A. Edison, who was an inventor and sort of an ingenious kind of person. And then he took another character that's really fascinating. And this is a man named Swami Vivekananda. He was a Hindu. And this is another story that's very important. When the Chicago exhibit, the Columbia exhibition of 1893 opened in early 1893, there was an event in September, if you can believe this or not, September 11th, 1893 was the beginning of the Parliament of Religions. They brought in about 170 religious leaders from all over the world. Most of them were from Christianity, but meant they were people, there were Hindus and Buddhists, Confucianisms, all the different religions were represented. And Swami Vivekananda was a Hindu, and he got up during that session, spoke only about 11 minutes, and what did he talk about? He talked about fanaticism. He talked about the plague of the world was fanaticism, that in fact people had just been so bloodied over the years because they didn't tolerate one another, they didn't respect one another, sometimes fanaticism related to religion or politics, what have you. He became an instant hit. He went on the circuit for several years after that, became a millionaire in his own time, went back to India, and he was a famous guy. Well, he had the turban, he was very charismatic, he was also a symbol for the wizard.
And when you describe those four men, those four characters, I can see that mishmash in the character of the wizard. And the wizard is rehabilitated later, which makes me feel much better. I want to know that he's going to be rescued and rehabilitated.
And that's why I could use him as a symbol for humility and other virtues, because he does become a virtuous person in the sequels, primarily because of Glinda. Glinda works with him and empowers him and says, you've got to go in the right direction. So he becomes a truly humble and noble servant in the sequels. But it's all due to Glinda.
Well, we've got to talk about a piece of the book that is so unique and interesting. There are QR codes throughout the book. Tell me about those QR codes.
The QR codes we're now seeing, and they weren't as visible years ago, but you can open up only any part of the book and see them, and you can see them in many places in society today. But what they are two-dimensional barcodes that you can use an iPhone or other smartphones to download videos that are on YouTube. So what I tried to do is we made a whole series of videos in connection with our work at Texas Tech University to show various aspects of what faculty and students do. And so we used these videos that you can download to learn different points. You'll find a video in there of an attorney who talks about her own experiences going into libraries as a child and reading the Oz sequels. You'll see another video of a history professor who says that Oz has been very important to her in her personal journey. You picked out a page where you could see a video of a professor of theater and a professor of mechanical engineering who do integrated scholarship and how important that is as a part of the learning part of the book. You know, the learning part is based on an old aphorism that where you stand is where you sit. Well, it's also what you read, what you write, how you communicate, and what you experience. And those are the chapters in the learning section of the book. And in every section of the book, there's an attempt to integrate all of the different elements of the book. What does learning mean relative to wisdom? Learning is not wisdom. Stalin and Hitler were very, very smart people, but they weren't wise. Wise people are people who use learning to do for others, to serve others, to care for others. And if you're wise, that's what you ought to be. That's how you ought to be moving your learning.
When I read the press material, one of the recommendations was that the book is for college-bound students. There were several different kinds of students were listed, but I thought it was very interesting that it's also recommended for counselors and teachers. I would absolutely eat this book up if I were still teaching high school English, because it just gives such a different dynamic to the whole idea. And what would be, if you could distill the bottom line message for The Way of Oz, what would it be?
Well, I would say that read as much as you can, find out all the different models for personal and professional development and fulfillment, and don't cast aside anything you've learned up till now. You have to put what I've written into the context of where you are and what your beliefs are and what your family beliefs are. But there are pearls in here that I hope you can pull out. And the pearls really are, you have to learn. You have to be a continual learner for all of your life. I talk about walking down and marching down the yellow brick road of life. You have to care about people all your life. That's very important. You have to serve people all of your life. And when I do the charge to our graduates or to the new students coming into tech, I say to them, you've got to be learning all of your life, care about people all of your life, serve people all of your life, and then think about leadership position. We're giving you the framework for learning at Tech, as you'll find in many, many fine universities in the United States, but you've got to fill in that framework for the rest of your life and be of service to people. And then you can be reading about Oz and about the Oz book and thinking about what are those leadership characteristics. How does planning fit in? How does my consciousness of sustainability fit in? How do my ideas about diversity fit into the world? And what should I be thinking about in terms of science, political understanding, and my own personal responsibility to go forward?
It really is a book about how to live your life. It's really about values and beliefs and looking at your own value and belief system and thinking, how do my values and beliefs fit in with this idea? Because I mean, this is such a much bigger idea. And I had no idea, I have to confess, that there were 13 sequels. I've never read anything. You've made me want to, that lifelong learner idea, go out and get one of the sequels or all 13 and see how that evolves. There's just so much in the book that I really wish we had a full hour to sit and talk. Bob, you've just been fascinating and wonderful and so interesting.
Thank you.
Texas Tech and the students at Texas Tech are really so lucky to have you for their provost.
Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. The Way of Oz is very readable, and I want to give the illustrator, let's quickly, we've only got about a minute. Tell me a little bit about Dusty.
Dusty, I've worked with Dusty on 3 books, and Dusty is a very, very talented graphic designer and artist who lives in Bryan, Arkansas, near Little Rock, Arkansas. He's a graduate of the University of Arkansas. I first met him when I was the provost at the University of Arkansas, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful person. And he and I work together much like Baum and Denslow did on some of their projects, because he'll give me some rough drafts and he'll say, you know, how do you think these fit? And then I'll give him some ideas back. I'll give you one real quick one. Toto is not a Cairn Terrier, as he was in the movie, because in the sequels, Toto was a French Bulldog, and we have French Bulldogs, so it's modeled after one of our French Bulldogs.
I love it. Bob, thank you so much for visiting with us today.
Sure, you bet. My pleasure.
We'd like to thank you for being with us, and pick up The Way of Oz. It's that good book. Start reading, and we'll see you next time here on Conversations Cafe.